So greetings, everyone. A very warm welcome to you all to the first webinar of our Fall 2023 series. This webinar is hosted by the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center, which is based at the University of Colorado, Boulder. I'm Imtiaz Rangwala, Climate Science Lead at the North Central CASC, co-hosting this webinar with my colleague, Heather Yoakum, who is our Social Science Lead. We bring you these webinars to facilitate a discussion of science, research, and best practices related to adaptation and resource management under a rapidly changing climate, with a focus on the North Central US that encompasses the Missouri and the Upper Colorado River basins. Before I introduce our speaker, a quick word on housekeeping. We are recording this webinar, and you can find all our webinar recordings on our website. During the webinar, all participants will be muted, but you will have the ability to unmute during the Q&A period at the end. We, however, encourage you to put your questions and comments in the chat box anytime during the webinar, and we will start with those questions first during the Q&A in the order they are received. Today's speaker is Dr. Kate Rottler. Kate is the New Mexico Climate Adaptation Specialist for the South Central Climate Adaptation Science Center, which is hosted by the University of Oklahoma in Norman. She works with natural and cultural resource managers in New Mexico to facilitate climate adaptation by connecting them with the resources and researchers of the South Central CASC. In addition to working with CASC collaborators and information end users, Kate has engaged extensively in science communication with diverse audiences that includes K through 12 students, farmers and ranchers, fellow scientists, community members, and politicians. Prior to working for the CASC, Kate worked for the USDA Southern Plains Climate Hub as the Climate Hub Fellow, where she engaged in both research and outreach with agricultural land managers in the context of climate adaptation. Kate is a rangeland and reclamation ecologist by training and did her doctoral research on the recovery of sagebrush plant communities and soil in southwestern Wyoming after oil and gas development. And she claims that she'll never tire of talking about sagebrush with anyone and everyone. Her title, the title of her webinar today is the Ogallala Data Directory, a tool for Ogallala Aquifer region researchers and decision makers. Okay, thank you for presenting this webinar, and please take it away.
Thank you. I want to first start out by saying that this was definitely not a project I did by myself. It was also done with the support of Dr. Renee McPherson, who's also at the South Central CASC, and then with Gregory Newman and Amy Cramen, both of whom are at the Colorado State University, and who helped. We worked really closely on designing this whole website and on this whole project. So I think Amy may be here. I don't know if Greg is, and I can't see the participant list. So we'll see who's here when I finish.
Kate, we don't see your video if you want to show yourself.
Oh, sorry, I unmuted myself, but forgot to unvideo mute myself.
Here we see you, right.
Good. You can see me now. So let me, okay, good, it is gonna work. So I want to start with a little bit of background on the Ogallala Aquifer, and especially I want to start by noting that this area that you see in gray here, that is the Ogallala Aquifer, the original inhabitants and stewards of this area are and were the Sioux, Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ponca, Pawnee, and Kiowa tribes, and many of them still live in the area and are still stewarding the area. And so it's important to recognize them. Water in the aquifer was originally deposited between 2 and 6 million years ago, certainly not all at once. It was deposited all through that time period. Aquifer recharge has always occurred faster in the north than in the south, and you can kind of see that. Can y'all see my cursor?
We can. Thank you. We
Okay,
can.
great. I'll use it as a pointer. So you can see actually up here in the north that there are the water level is rising up here in the north, whereas pretty much all in the south, all it's doing is declining, with like some little notable exceptions, I guess, in parts of Texas and Oklahoma. So the northern reaches benefit partially, it's because they have higher precipitation as well as lower evaporation, just because of climatically where they are. But historically, they also benefited from the prairie pothole region, which is up there. And they also have really porous soil as well as more porous bedrock up in this region. So the water gets into the aquifer faster, in addition to not evaporating as quickly. There are not as many prairie potholes at all as there used to be. The recharge would have been even greater when there were still prairie potholes in that region. Most of those have been filled in due to agriculture. This black outline here is the Ogallala Aquifer, so that what we were just looking at. And large-scale water extraction began over the aquifer in the late 1940s. That was when technology finally allowed people to drill deep enough and run pumps that were strong enough to really pull the water out of the Ogallala Aquifer. In addition to agriculture, which is this brown color, is all cropland. Not necessarily all cropland that's irrigated by the Ogallala Aquifer, but you can see how much cropland there is in this region. In addition to that agriculture area, the Ogallala Aquifer provides water to over 2.3 million people. And that includes some cities. So part of the water supply, for example, of Amarillo is pulled from the Ogallala Aquifer. So it's not just providing water for agriculture. The row crops in this region, especially irrigated row crops, have replaced grassland as the dominant land cover. So the grassland in this region was anything from like kind of the short, scrubby, deserty grassland down here to more of the middle, like mixed grass prairies and a little bit of short grass prairie kind of over towards this side. But that would have been the original land cover in this area. So 90% basically of the water pumped from the Ogallala Aquifer is used for agriculture, and that's mostly irrigated crops. It also includes, however, livestock. So where, like Amarillo has these huge livestock operations, and there are other large feedlots and other large livestock raising operations throughout this entire area, and many of them pump water from the Ogallala Aquifer. The rate of depletion exceeds the rate of recharge in pretty much all areas, except again up here in Nebraska and South Dakota, where they have the different bedrock and different conditions. Withdrawing water is becoming completely unfeasible in a lot of these heavily depleted areas. So basically what that means is that the technology to pull the water out may exist, but it's too expensive to run the pumps. So they would be losing more money than they would be gaining to even try to pump that water out of the ground. And frankly, in some areas, the saturation has gotten so low that the best pump in the world cannot pull water that's not there. And there are areas where there is so little water that no pump could pull anything out. The aquifer regulations differ across various jurisdictional boundaries. That includes state boundaries, but it also can include county boundaries, as well as tribal boundaries and city regulations. So who can drill, what they can drill, how those wells are registered, what the water's used for. All of that kind of differs from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, and that can make managing this really complicated. Because the Ogallala is so incredibly important, though, to American agriculture, there actually is an abundance of data available to assist in various management decisions, as well as understanding the aquifer. And so there's everything from information on the water, the surface water that connects to it's like the aquifer provides base flow, to these saturated thickness and depletion rate maps that you can find online pretty easily. In terms of climate, these are just some maps from the National Climate Assessment, showing how the climate is expected to change, both by the mid-21st and late 21st century. Generally, and as you can see by these maps, the temperatures are expected to increase. Specifically, summers are expected to become hotter and drier, which will compound any kind of evapotranspiration that happens. And then, of course, evaporation is expected to increase. And the seasonality of precipitation, as well as storm intensity, is expected to change. And all of this will make it that much harder to access usable water. So the water's going to run out more easily. And it makes it harder to predict how much water you're going to need, because we're heading into, we talk about it all the time, territory that we haven't really seen before as far as making decisions. And so deciding how to deal with the Ogallala Aquifer in the longer term is becoming a bigger and bigger challenge. So there are various management challenges associated with the Ogallala Aquifer, both surface and ground, and Ogallala aquifer water. So that depletion rate exceeds the recharge rate, and it's spatially heterogeneous. So the depletion rate is greater in the southern end than in the upper end. And both water demands as well as water loss are generally expected to increase. Second, the data needed to support long-term longevity of ecosystems as well as economic systems can be difficult to efficiently locate and access. What I mean by that is that while those data are out there, they may be in various different places. They're on state websites, they're on nonprofit websites, they're on federal, completely different federal websites, because the federal government puts data all over the place. And so that can make it really challenging to even locate them. And then accessing them is another story entirely. They may not be somewhere where you can easily download them. This means that the depth and breadth of the available data are fairly unclear. So it's hard to understand what we have, and then accordingly, how do we get what we still need? And so that makes it really difficult to identify any of the gaps in our current knowledge. We had two basic objectives with this project. The first was to just increase discoverability as well as accessibility of Ogallala region data sets, and that includes data sets from tribal, federal, NGO, and private sources, to those working in and around the region. So make it easier for researchers as well as land managers to actually find and then access these data. Second, we wanted to facilitate the exchange of data sets as well as ideas in terms of research about those data sets by uniting the data set information in a single place so that we can get an idea of what we have versus what we need. The approach that we used, so we worked with a website developer, that's Greg, as well as, at the time, she was the coordinator for the Ogallala Water Cap, Amy Crayman, and we built the Ogallala Data Directory. That's that acronym. We gave it the acronym ODD. We built it on the pre-existing Coordinated Agricultural Projects database. So they were required to make data available as part of their grant. And since that architecture already existed, and since we wanted to make sure that people were also seeing those data sets, we just built our project on top of their pre-existing database. we located data sets all over everywhere, on state, university, and NGO websites primarily. And then we hand entered that metadata information. So the data directory, other than the CAPS data that's stored there, the data sets that we found for the data directory are not stored on the data directory. The data directory stores metadata records that point you to those data sets. And we hand entered those when we found data sets. We also searched data.gov to add metadata via their API. So if you search data.gov, you will pull back results that come from state, federal, all over. Their API crawls all kinds of different websites to look for data sets. And so we also can communicate with their API to add those metadata records to the data directory, and we're in the process of doing that. It's run into a few hiccups, but they'll get there. We also developed a visualization using state water well records, and then we added that as an overlay to a mapping function. So we currently have a mapping function on the website that will show you a map of the data directory, and then it shows you also point, like you'll see it in a minute, little point markers for each data set that was manually input where I had location information. And so we also developed this overlay of state water well records, which I'll talk about in a moment, to that mapping function, so that you can kind of see, it's by county, but so that you can kind of see where the most water wells are versus the least water wells. And it's a pretty cool map. It had some challenges. The current features of the data directory, first and foremost, and the functionality that's been there the longest, is adding and managing metadata records. So anyone with an account can add metadata records or manage records that they've already added. It's dead easy to get an account. You just go to the web page and sign up for an account. You're not signing up to receive a million emails or anything like that. It's just to make sure that we're not getting like bots or something adding all kinds of weird stuff to the data directory. And then when people add records, currently, if I have yet to have anyone add a data record other than me. But if someone adds a data record, then we will check them to make sure that they are like legitimate, supposed to be their data records, as opposed to like data records for a non-Ogallala aquifer, like one that's in Georgia or something that is in no way connected to the Ogallala Aquifer. We can also run record searches, so it works just like your Google search engine or any other search engine. You can run a search of the data using text strings, just like you would do anywhere else you search for things. And then, of course, there's the map. And the map shows the area of interest outline for certain data sets, for applicable data sets where we're able to come up with an area of interest outline. And it also shows the centroid of the data set where I could either calculate or one was given. So it's not all of them. The Ogallala water cap data, they don't have centroids or area of interest outlines, but I think most of the ones that I added do. And I am going to show y'all the website in real time rather than having you just look at pretty pictures that I took of the website. So this is the landing page when you go, either when you go to the website that little QR code gives you, or when you go to this link, it will pull up this website, the landing page. To register, you just scroll down until you see register, and that'll take you to the page to register for an account. It literally takes like 3 minutes, if even that. But mostly you can get to the data sets either by clicking on add metadata, or you can go up here to data sets. And that will bring you to the list O data sets. So there are, as I said, various data sets are in here. You can search. I always like using New Mexico as an example because I am who I am. So if you put in New Mexico in this search window, you will get back every data set that has New Mexico in the description, in a tag, in a place, etc. So you can see various of these web pages that you can go to, and it will show you how to access the data set. The other thing you can do once you have your account is you can click add data set. You don't have to do this one. Well, cool. So the project name is irrelevant. You choose it's an unaffiliated data set. The rest of this is fairly self-explanatory. So only certain of these fields are required. We require the title, the primary author, a description, and then contact information for the data set. So in some cases, this is a different individual than the person who primarily authored the data set, and that's why they're two different fields. Spatial coverage locations is a text string box, but then the spatial coordinates box, if you provide spatial coordinates in latitude and longitude, then we can make sure that it has a little centroid marker on the map. Temporal coverage, all we require is a start date because we recognize that not all data sets are done, and some data sets are like monitoring data sets, which don't have an end date because they're constantly updated. And so we don't have an end date required, but obviously if it's a data set that was collected at one point in time, an end date would make sense. The rest of this is all pretty much optional, but I do want to point out, we use keywords and tags to help with the search function. So those are nice if you provide them. And they use, the keywords are National Ag Library keywords. So that's a predetermined list, and they'll autofill as you start typing. Oh, that's nice. I love that. Amazing. So anyway, when you put keywords in here, you'll get back if there's any matches. The tags can be any kind of, like, they're user generated, so you can fill in any tags you want. We recognize that not all data sets are published anywhere. And so there is the option to just do this later, which means you're saying, there is no, online location for this. And so those would be for records that are, for example, not made widely available to the public. So sometimes tribes have data and they want to know who's using the data, and so they share them on a case-by-case basis. And in that case, we want them to be able to tell people, like, we have this data, but we don't want to force anyone to make data available that they don't want to make available. And that's why this has this option here. If it is published online somewhere, then you can put in the link to the published data set. And then these last two ones, like, the embargo is auto set to no because, like, it doesn't matter anymore anyway. And then OCAP data set is specifically to tell the system that it is specific to the old OCAP project as opposed to the Ogallala data directory. And so you always select no on that. And then you hit add data set and it just puts it in the system. So once you do that, you can actually access it on this search page. It'll show everywhere, and it'll show in your personal profile 77 data sets because I've added so many. So it'll show you data sets you created, and you can go in and change, you can edit any of the editable fields in that form that I just showed you. The other way that you can browse data sets, so in addition to doing this nice little search tool, you can also browse data sets by going to the map. And here's our pretty map that I'm very proud of. So Greg's been working so hard on this map. What you see here is, you see there's these little centroids mark the center of the data set, where I could get the center of the data set. If there was not a center for the data set, so for example, this one, it's Colorado Natural Heritage Program data, and their data overlaps with the Ogallala Aquifer, but is not just in the Ogallala Aquifer region. It's in all of Colorado. So that's why sometimes these centroids are outside of the area. Okay, thank you. Cool. Why they're in the area of interest. These colors, the darker the color, the more dense the well pads per square, like it's just a count of the number of well pads within the county. So these are all county boundaries, and you can see like the really dark ones are where the most where the most water wells are. It was really interesting trying to get these data, and I'll talk about that in a minute when I talk about challenges. But you can also like get rid of the data sets and just see a pretty picture of the different counties. There's a ton of wells here in New Mexico. I think this county, is maybe one of the Nebraska counties has the highest number of wells that I found in any one county in any of the states in the Ogallala Aquifer region. And when I looked at the use for those wells, it came down to oil and gas, which is really interesting. So you can also turn on and off the different states if you have one that you're more interested in than the other, and you can turn off the boundary and just see the different colors. You can also turn all the colors off if you want. So that was a fun thing that we did as part of this project that initially seemed like it would be a lot more simple than it found it to be. I'm gonna go back to sharing, get to the correct slide. So we did have some challenges with this project. First of all, finding as well as accessing records was more challenging than I expected. Data are collected for different purposes across different scales, and they're stored and published in just so many different formats and on so many different platforms. A really good example is spatial data. So even though there are a lot of spatial data, they're not always in the same format. And when they are in the same format, they sometimes are available on like different platforms. So a lot of spatial data is available as part of a mapping platform. And occasionally there would be in a help file or in a how-to or frequently asked questions, you could get the link to the actual data from the platform, but in other cases, the platform just showed you the spatial file, but there was no way to actually find out where those data were living online. And so then that would require starting to email people. And in one case, I emailed someone and he just had to send me the data. And so to this day, there's entry for it in the data directory that just says to email him if you need the well pad. If you need the well records for, I believe it was South Dakota, they're not online except in the form of a mapping application, and you can't pull the data directly from there in the way that I wanted to pull it. There's also a lot of incomplete metadata. So we used the National Ag Library's metadata requirements, which requires certain fields to be used. Not every data set had those metadata, and so we had to like put placeholders, so NA or something like that in that field to be able to add a record for those data. There's also a lack of metadata standardization. So maybe they were using a different standard than the National Ag Library uses, which meant that they had different required fields. And so that could also be fairly complicated. The map layers were a challenge that I was not expecting, right? I expected, I'm going to get these well records, and then I'm going to put them in Google Earth Engine or QGIS or something, and they're just going to chart up all nice, and I'm going to have all these points that you can click on, and I don't know what kind of a world I was living in, but it was a fantasy world where computers are capable of a lot more than here in our real world. So one of the challenges is just how many wells there are over the Ogallala Aquifer, which I did not realize the sheer number of them until I tried to put them all in the same map, at which point my computer crashed because it was not capable of loading up all of the wells in the Ogallala Aquifer region without just it just exploded. I had to restart the entire computer. And when we tried to get the website to load it similarly, the website was not having any of it. So the map would just throw an error. We then tried to reduce the number by putting it by 10 kilometers and doing 10-kilometer, grid cells. That also was too much for my computer could handle it, but it was too much for the website to handle. And so that's why we ultimately settled on the county level data, is because that was the only way that we could get the website to actually display that that map layer, because there are so incredibly many wells in this region. And even just finding those well records was a real challenge because not everyone calls them water wells. New Mexico calls them points of diversion, and online you have to search for pods, which no one knows that. And then other places, we'll call them something else. So it was a really interesting experience seeing how the terminology differs state to state, seeing how the amount of information provided changes state to state. Well uses were all over, all over the map, no pun intended, with some places having 1 of 5 uses, and I can't remember which state had over 40 possible uses for water wells. And it was impossible to make any cross comparison at that point. So it was a really interesting exercise, and I understand now why there isn't one of these maps for this region, because it's really hard to harmonize the data to each other. So the data directory will remain available for as long as the servers that it's on at CSU are running. I suppose if CSU decided to tear out the servers, then it would go away, but no one anticipates them doing that. So basically it'll be hosted on CSU servers in perpetuity. User submissions are always open, and we plan on them continuing to be that way, with quality checking both by automated systems. So we automated checking for duplicate records, but also by hand. I don't anticipate that people are going to go so bonkers over this that they're going to be sending in hundreds of data sets a day and I just drown in them. So I'm happy to keep checking them by hand if they come in, if and as they come in. We are continuing outreach to potential users via presentations like this, but also through print means. So we're planning on doing a press release, as well as blog articles, and we are writing the whole thing up as a scientific article that we're gonna submit to a journal. And then finally, there's a lot of potential to build on this data directory with other projects. So in the same way that we built on the Ogallala water cap with the data directory, we hope and would be happy for other people with ideas to build on the data directory with their own projects and their own ideas. And the data directory has been in a couple other proposals for funding, as this pre-existing architecture is here and we need somewhere to make data available, and so we would like to build on what's already there. And we're always happy to hear if people have ideas or think they might want to use it in some way. We would be more than happy to hear from you. That would actually be fantastic. I would be so excited. I want to point out, so this is the 10 by 10 kilometer map, and the little dots that you can see just flooding the background are the individual well pad records. I managed to pull a screenshot before my entire computer just died. But that's what that looks like. It's pretty wild. So I want to thank the members of the advisory committee who worked as part of this I should have talked about them earlier. I don't know why I missed that. The advisory committee was made up of various stakeholders as well as a representative from the Ogallala Rosebud Sioux Reservation, and they helped us figure out how to make the website useful and usable. They also helped us find data sets and gave us all kinds of advice. And without them, we could not have done this project. They were very important. And also anyone who has contributed data sets or suggested locations for finding them, because I don't know everything. So I had to have help finding them. And then the project was funded by the USGS by a grant to the South Central CASC, and additional support was provided by the USDA, Southern Plains Climate Hub. So with that, I am happy to take any questions, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen unless, do you want me to stop sharing my screen?
Let's do that, and you can go back to it if needed.
Yeah. And if somebody needs the slides, then I can reshare it. Hey, Amy's here.
Thanks very much. Kate, that was great. I see a few questions trickling into our chat box. People appreciating your work and your willingness to tell the story about it. So first question is from Anna Hermes about how long did it take you to create and populate a directory?
So it was kind of already created in a sense because we were just building it on top of OCAP's pre-existing architecture. And I don't know, Amy could tell you how long that took to make. I think it was a significant amount of time. So if we'd had to build this from scratch, it would have taken a heck of a lot longer and cost so much more money. The fact that we were able to build on something that they had already built as part of a NIFA grant was, it wouldn't exist if we hadn't been able to do that. Most of the time that it took me was even just finding data sets. Entering them once I found them was not a big deal. It takes maybe 5 minutes to enter one of those records if you have all the information. The challenge was finding them in the first place and occasionally finding the information that needed to go in the form for adding the metadata record. And that took, I didn't keep track of how many hours that took, but a long time.
Another question from Liz Payton. Does the system also include water quality data?
I believe if I could find water quality data, yes. However, I don't remember how much water quality data I was able to find. So if you know of water quality data over the aquifer or of the aquifer, I would love to know about it. And then I can always check and see if it's already in there and I won't put in a duplicate, but or you can submit a record. That would also be incredible. Whichever, yeah. I would love to include water quality data in short, but I don't know if there is right now. Amy, was there any water quality data with the OCAP data?
Not as much. I do know that there are sort of local and state sources of water quality data, and that in light of climate pressures on both the surface and groundwater supplies in the region, that there's water quality implications as well. Also, there's uranium and some weird water quality stuff in the region as well, that there's lots of data sets from USGS and other places. So it's the kind of thing that we should have in the directory, I think, for that sort of cross-pollinated. So we have some, but it wasn't part of the purview of the Ogallala Water Coordinated Ag Project. Was more of a water quantity and water management, dry land irrigated systems project rather than a water quality project. So our particular subset of data in there is not water quality focused.
Makes sense. Yeah, so we'll just open it up. Folks can unmute and show their video if they want. So just open the floor to everybody at this time. And as you're doing that, maybe I could throw in some questions for Kate. Kate, what kind of uses of data have you found?
So one thing that we have not done well / at all is track who's using the data directory and to what end. That would be a good thing to track. It's not something that we tracked as part of the project, although I do know that Greg is able to pull some metrics. So there's the possibility that we would at least be able to see how much usage the website is getting, how many hits, how many downloads, how long people are spending. But other than the fact that I used it to make that map, that was actually how I kept finding when I needed to go back and re-find those data sets for the well records. I was actually using the data directory because trying to find them again through a Google search was giving me headaches and heartburn. So now they're easy to find. You just have to go to the data directory and you can find them.
Yeah, but I'd be curious, like what kind of anticipated uses you think about,
Yeah.
and also how far does the data go back to? Sometime that could help.
I have no idea how old the oldest data set is, but it depends on the oldest date of whatever data sets are in there. So there are some that are perpetually modern in that they're monitoring data and they're regularly updated. And so as long as they're continued to be updated, they will be perpetually in the present. But some of those monitoring data also go back to like the 1940s. And it just depends on the data set. I don't think there are many that go back to the 1940s. I think it's mostly since probably the 80s and 90s is the bulk of the data, at least that I put in there. So yeah, but there are some data sets that go back a long old time. It's wild.
There's a lot of interesting questions about the use cases for that in that case. Like we have this subdivision within the CSU libraries called the Geospatial Centroid. And I actually just came in to consult with them like a week ago because one of the sort of water movers and shakers in the state who was like highly active in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s for ARS and CSU, doing a lot of the initial water monitoring as these wells were actually dug to start irrigating in that time period. He kept all of his papers and he basically gave all of his papers to the water archive at CSU. And now they're starting to digitize those records and kind of map everything out. And they were kind of trying to think about various ways, sort of the scholarly things and some of the other sort of more sort of biophysical questions that you might be able to ask now that you can kind of actually digitize a lot of these historic records. I mean, there's just so many directions you could go. There's sociological and anthropological things. There's biodata, biophysical questions. There's kind of interesting things about previous and future anticipated climate. Kind of the way we did versus the way we're gonna do. There's all kinds of interesting things that you could imagine. And this project is such a weird or interesting figment of time. When we started this, the National Ag Library, we would have hosted everything just at their site, but they couldn't take all these data types that we did as a project or that Kate has been able to kind of put together through these metadata records, right? The National Ag Library at the time was like, we can handle Excel files and we can handle a few more things, but we can't do this, that, and the other. We can't do all the things, right? Now they could probably do something like this. And Kate's challenge with doing the map really exemplifies how something of this importance and complexity kind of really merits a robust kind of computing system that probably could come from the federal level or something like when you think about OpenET or you think about something where a lot of investment goes in to do the processing and data viz. There's a huge opportunity here, but we're sort of in this moment in time where we're just realizing how to behave like that. So, right, it's like we can do the best we can do between somebody like a Kate and a Greg and a me. and it's clearly, it's good and it helps us see what could be. But we would love it if this became like the push to have key watersheds, key groundwater regions of the United States be supported in this way, so that all the different actors of different types could actually know what's what from each other's corners and actually see it, rather than it being in these digital filing boxes.
Yeah, I kind of had a question kind of following up on those lines. What do you kind of envision as kind of next steps, or where you're taking this in terms of kind of bringing people to the platform and building off of that? Do you guys have some kind of plans for that, or is that still kind of nebulous at this point, I guess?
So I have been giving, this is probably like the 10th or 11th time I've given this talk. So one way that we've been doing it is just by contacting anyone who has like a broad user group that might be in the region, and letting them know about it. And then of course there will be the press releases that we plan on disseminating widely to user groups that maybe we weren't able to reach with these talks. So like producer organizations and smaller like groundwater management districts or conservation districts or that kind of thing, for whom it would be impractical to kind of like, as a 3-person team, be able to get around to all of those groups. If we had like a 10-person team, it would make sense, send people to go talk to anyone they know. But I've also presented at ESA, and then I've forgotten all the various places off the top of my head that I've presented about this, but I've done a combination of posters and talks and webinars like this one, with everybody from like ARS to the casks, like anybody who I think might be interested. Amy, do you have?
Yeah, and I might add to that by just saying that we've talked as a group about talking with data.gov. We would like to be able to talk to them, and also the National Ag Library people are amazing. To really talk about where this kind of thing could actually have a home, because Kate may not be in her role forever. I have a completely different, I'm still managing a lot of researchers and public-private stakeholders across the High Plains, but I have a different job. The Ogallala Water Cat project, my job as the project manager for that ended in 2021. And so this is like a love, and it's really, really needed. But one of the things that we are doing, and I've sort of managed to wangle it in my current role, one of the things we did as that former CAP team is have these 8-state Ogallala summits that involved a few hundred very diverse actors, city managers, water district people, producers, federal agency people. Brings together tribal folks, just basically trying to bring together people understanding where we're at today and what's actually really working for supporting the aquifer and communities that depend on it. So we're going to hold the next Ogallala Summit. We try to do this every 2 to 3 years. And so we're really wangled through my new job to actually be able to, it's not my old job, it's my new job, to have the next Ogallala Summit in Kansas in April of 2024. And at that event, we will, I'm sure, be publicizing this tool to everyone to try to get that next push of like awareness and data added, and also then try to make that pitch to the powers that be that could sustain this beyond a Kate or beyond a me, and make it for something that the community could have for the long term, to see if we could get some traction there through that kind of high vis event that really does bring together the whole food chain, so to speak, of the people that are involved in thinking about this region.
And just one more, the other, I guess, kind of related to that metric side of things, do you have any kind of plans to, I don't know, or strategies for kind of demonstrating the value of such a kind of, of the effort that's gone into developing the directory, trying to capture that in a certain way? Or is it, I guess, just kind of that side of things?
Yeah, we've been talking about the metrics that Greg is actually capable of pulling on the website. And I don't think we've gotten an answer from him yet on what metrics he can pull. But that's definitely like, I don't know why it didn't occur to me at the time, probably because web design is not actually one of my skills. But it didn't occur to me to like collect metrics of some kind on like usership of the website. So basically what we'll have is what Greg is able to pull as far as metrics. And I think one time when we talked about it, it was, you know, the basic things that you would pull from any website. It would be very nice to know like specifics if people are using it for specific projects or to a specific end. But I don't know how we would collect those data, especially now that the funding project for this project is, or the funding period for this project is very much over. What we're doing now is kind of, I got permission to talk about it through my current job because part of my current job is kind of an extension type role. And so we can still fit it within my current duties, but it gets harder once there's basically the funding is gone. To be able to do things like that. The original funding was only for 3 years, which also is a little bit challenging to then morph that into collecting long-term data. Because you can collect it, but like, what are you going to do with it if you're not getting paid and that's not part of your job? It's definitely one of the challenges of like short-term projects that persist long-term. I know this is far from being the only one that's had that issue.
It does seem though that like too, like about the how much work to your question too about the effort and how much work it takes makes me think, Kate, that, you know, there's a sustainable ag system. The CAP that this started with was a sustainable ag systems project through USD and NIFA. And there is a SAS CAP community of practice that meets monthly that involves project managers and project directors from across the US now that actually our CAP actually helped to expand and further develop. So it's like a really robust group of people that gets together every month. And I almost feel like giving this talk, but with Zach's comment there about how much work it takes to do this thing, it would be really great because NIFA, like a lot of other places, requires all the project teams, these extensive multidisciplinary project teams, to have these data management protocols where they actually create these databases. So ideally that data can become discoverable and usable. And it's not a lot of people's skill sets. And then sustaining those things beyond the life of a project involves cost and people. And having NIFA's greater awareness of the learning curve that goes into such a thing, I think would be a great thing to share. So I'm really glad you pointed that out, Zach, because if they're asking us to do those things, it's for a good reason, for science transparency and for people understanding how taxpayer dollars are used, but also to make that data useful, really useful for the longer term, for the sustainable ag outcomes that they're supporting. So we need to ask them to figure out how they can help current and future teams that are tasked with these kinds of things actually go the distance on that investment. And we don't know, you know, that's not, like Kate said, it's not really your job when you are tasked with setting this thing up. Once the funding is done, really making these data gatherings really useful. It needs a more robust framework for success, I think. Maybe we just need to talk to the libraries, all of them. The librarians can help us. They can save the day.
Yeah.
More questions? We have time for a couple more. So building up on that metrics. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, this isn't a very well thought out question, so that's my hesitancy to ask it. But I think this kind of work seems so important, and it seems like such a cool database. And in my previous experiences working with different types of data and trying to bring them all together, there's always this sort of continued issue of just like data errors in any data set. And I'm curious about your experience with that in collecting data, and if there was any sort of visualization or kind of like checking of the data sets at all, and what your experience was with that, and maybe best practices. I'd love to learn from you.
Yeah, so as I didn't, I assumed if the data sets were published online that someone had done their own QA QC on them. And so I didn't do any QA QC on any of the data. The only data actually that I worked really extensively with the actual data themselves, as opposed to just creating a metadata record, were those well records. And I will say that I think they probably have some QA QC problems, just because of like weird stuff that I would find with missing fields for half the data set would be missing a field, and then it would be transposed in another column. And that was one of the reasons why it became such an issue to deal with well uses. So an original iteration of that, and you could see a little bit of it in that last picture that I showed you, was where I had colored wells by use. And one way I did that was starting to just categorize when they had too many well uses. I would categorize them by like easy, municipal, ag, business, whatever. There were maybe 5 uses. I used, I think it was South Dakota's had 5 well uses. And so I simplified it to theirs. And there were a lot of really weird little issues, even with just the well pad use column in a number of different well pad. I'm sorry, I worked on well pads for so long, they're in my brain. There were a number of different well records that just had really odd uses. Like you would have a dual use that was agriculture, but also business, or agriculture, but also municipal. And I don't think that's necessarily like, I think they set their system up to be able to do that. And I have no doubt that that actually means something to them. But for anyone else to be able to use that data, like, how do you know which well use that actually is? If you've got 3 different well uses, 4 different well uses for one well, then how do you know, like, what do you categorize that as even? There were times that I would just end up with like a well pad in China, because someone had entered the point data wrong. Like, right, that's a pretty clear QA QC issue. If you've got like a whole chunk of well records that someone entered and they accidentally got their negative sign in the wrong place. So yeah, I think those were the only ones that I looked at and was like, oh yes, we have some QA QC problems here. But yeah, for the most part, I assumed that if they were making the data publicly available on a state website or an NGO website or a federal website, that like those data had been checked by someone.
Good answer, Kate. So the answer is, Megan, that's a great question, and it's a huge problem that doesn't really have an answer. For the CAP data that's in there at the core, we did an internal team check. So basically, we just had an internal peer review process. So people would put their stuff in, and then we would tag. We did about like a 70-person team, and we would actually and it was a great thing, I think, for some of the students and postdocs and stuff working with faculty and stuff, actually to be able to cross-check each other's stuff as peers and basically be like, you do work in this area, you're familiar with this type of data format, you look at the metadata record, you look at the data, you suggest revisions. And so we sort of had that internal team process to get the things done as a team.
Great. Thank you very much, both Kate and Amy, for taking on the Q&A. We just on the top of the hour. And thanks again for putting together this data directory. Good luck.
Yeah.
As you move
Thank
forward.
you all.
And thanks again for presenting.
Yep.
Take care, everyone.
Thanks, you as well. Bye.
Bye.